So good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I hope everyone was able to connect and is hearing this well. Welcome. We're going to get started. So thank you for joining us for this webinar where we are going to discuss engagement and the ethics of working with communities in human-wildlife conflict around the world. This is a joint event organized by the Human-Wildlife Conflict Task Force with the Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, of the UN. And what we'd like to do today is look a little bit at some case studies that really illustrate some of the key points and key challenges we have in addressing human-wildlife conflict. Can we go back to the previous slide, please? Thank you. So what we thought we'd do here is that this will hopefully become a series in which we look at the lessons learned from around the world, really the practice of managing human-wildlife conflict, which is sometimes very, very difficult in practice, more so than in theory. And so what we really want to look at today is the lessons learned and the advice and the insights from different experiences around the world. And we are very, very lucky today to have with us a number of speakers and panelists who I'll introduce in a minute, who are hugely experienced in this, decades of work on the ground. And we're going to look at really what they've learned that we can transfer to other cases around the world. And so to give you a little bit of context here, how this came about. So we're looking at cases of human-wildlife conflict that kind of illustrate key points in the principles of good practice or good management of human-wildlife conflict. As many of you know, in the IUCN task force on human-wildlife conflict, we are working on preparing IUCN guidelines. And these guidelines are really intended to be framework guidance. They're not a how-to manual of any sort. They are really about understanding the principles and figuring out what are the key considerations that work across cases. And really very much the emphasis in this is about process and planning. And so the challenge we, of course, have with any human-wildlife conflict anywhere in the world is that these cases are increasing very, very rapidly. They occur basically absolutely everywhere, whether you're dealing with the classic kind of carnivore or elephant conflicts or birds or marine species, whatever it may be. And of course, at the core of all of this is always people and the tensions that exist between the different people, communities, different stakeholders involved. And of course, these conflicts are constantly changing. We're not dealing with static situations. These are complex, they're dynamic. And how do we continually learn and adapt as we go? The other enormous challenge is that every single case is different from the next. I think everybody on listening who has worked on human-wildlife conflict will have found this. You simply cannot come up with some kind of instruction manual or template that you can take from one place and simply copy paste somewhere else. It needs adaptation to local cultures, situations, levels of tensions, all sorts of things. And yet we're faced in limited resources with a vast number of cases where action is urgently needed quite often. So what can we actually learn about principles and about process that we can transfer across and help each other out? So today is really about reflecting on that kind of learning. And because there are so many things we could cover in this, we've decided in this first seminar to look particularly at community engagement and all the nuances around that, because that is a very, very common component of working with conflict and coexistence. So what we've got today is we're looking at, we're going to have 3 short presentations. Could I have the next slide about the program, please? we're going to have 3 short presentations from around the world, illustrating some case experiences of working with communities and what was learned in the process. And then we're actually going to join in 4 more members of the IUCN task force as panelists to help discuss some of those learnings and also pitch in their experiences from yet further places around the world. And so this is very much about discussing and reflecting on that together, learning from each other and trying to capture that. For those who are listening in as participants, you can then also put your questions into the chat. And so we can try and cover and answer those as much as we have time to do. So we are going to start with a few presentations. Let me describe can we have the next slide, please? The one, yeah. So we've got 3 presentations. The first one is from Nathalie van Vliet, who's going to tell us about her work in Guyana. Then we have Vidya Athreya from India, speaking about an interesting case study from that region, followed by Professor Amy Dickman, speaking about human-wildlife conflict in Tanzania. And then we have our panelists joining us, Jenny Glickman, Sogi Roy, Juliet Young, and Catherine Hill from the task force to reflect further on and ask each other questions about this. Can we have the next slide? So for those participating and listening in, you can at any time throughout pose questions into the Q&A. There's a button at the bottom of the Zoom panel where you can do that. You can also vote for questions that are similar to what you wanted to ask, so it gets upvoted and we'll ask the ones that are more popular and we'll prioritize those. And you can absolutely use the chat box to add your comments and chat with others and contribute your thoughts, which we'd like to capture as well. Everybody's muted in this, and we will be spotlighting the speakers and their presentations as we go through. So with that, I would like to introduce our first speaker. If we could get the slides ready, we would like to bring in Nathalie van Vliet, who's a program lead and researcher at CIFOR, the Center for International Forestry Research, and one of the partners of the Sustainable Wildlife Management Program. And she's going to be telling us about experiences of working with communities in Guyana. I'll hand over to Nathalie. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Nathalie van Vliet. I work for the Center for International Forestry Research, and I'm very happy that I was invited to participate in this session. I'm going to briefly present the human-wildlife component of our work in Guyana. This work is part of a wider project implemented as part of the Sustainable Wildlife Management Program, which aims at ensuring that wildlife ecosystems and their services are conserved and the living conditions, food security, and cultural identity of rural villages are improved. Our work takes place in the Rupununi region, located at the southern end of Guyana, near the border with Brazil. The primary habitat types found in the Rupununi are open savannas, lowland and mountain tropical deciduous and evergreen forests, and what is locally called bush islands, which are forest patches scattered across the savannas on hilltops where the topsoil remains out of the reach of the seasonal floodwaters. The SWM Guyana program is working closely with the locally driven Livestock Producers Association, which represents ranchers and indigenous communities that own cattle in the region as their main economic activity. This region has traditionally been home to a large-scale, extensive, and flourishing livestock production sector long before the independence. With the independence in the 60s, indigenous communities also started to engage in cattle ranching. However, with the first emergence of foot and mouth disease, the sector entered a long-lasting crisis which has not yet seen its end. So over the last decades, cattle herds have been decreasing in size, and producers have also started to diversify into chicken, pork, and goat production. Nevertheless, cattle production remains a main economic activity in the region and is very representative to the Guyanese vaquero culture, as you can see from those pictures. Prior to the project, a survey was carried out in 2015, which indicated that each year, residents can lose between 10 to 25% of their total stock. 52% indicated that conflicts occur a few times a year, and 33% a few times per month. 80% of the households identified jaguars as the most problematic wild animal in their lives. 60% said that they don't like having jaguars around, and 53% indicated that they would actively try to kill jaguars in response to livestock depredation. Based on these preliminary results, it became obvious that wildlife management activities implemented through the SWM program could not ignore human-wildlife interactions and conflicts. To ensure active participation of indigenous communities and ranches in the development of the human-wildlife activities of this project, we first ensured that they were well represented in the site steering committee of the project, where action plans are developed, approved, monitored, and evaluated, ensuring a continuous participation of the beneficiaries in all relevant steps of the project. We carried out a free, prior, and informed consent process to ensure that communities were actively engaging in this project. Methodologies were developed to ensure the active participation of the beneficiaries in the development of methodologies, data collection, data analyses, and the development of recommendations for future solutions. The overall objective of the human-wildlife component of SWM in Guyana is to reduce the retaliatory killing of jaguars and other large carnivores by facilitating the development of data-driven cattle management strategies. First, in order to increase our understanding of the movements, activity patterns, and habitat selection of free-roaming cattle herds in the Rupununi savannas, we deployed GPS collars on 30 dominant bulls or cows, depending on the situation, with radio tags. Second, to understand current and historic frequency and distribution of livestock depredation in the Rupununi, we facilitated participatory risk mapping sessions. Then, we also analyzed spatial overlap of livestock and large carnivores, combining participatory mapping, camera trap data, and GPS collar data. Finally, we also carried out more than 150 interviews with cattle owners to further understand attitudes towards large carnivores and drivers of human-wildlife conflict. We are now analyzing the data and preparing to provide a feedback to cattle owners about the data generated. And together with them, we will identify possible solutions to their problems. We hope that this process will help us identify locally relevant and community-led solutions for a better coexistence of jaguar and other large carnivores and humans in the Rupununi. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Nathalie, for the fascinating case, and very nice to see something from this region also. So many questions already in our minds. I'm going to, however, go straight to our next speaker, Vidya. We got Vidya?
Yeah.
There we
Hi.
go.
Thanks.
Hi,
yeah.
Vidya. So Vidya is country director of the Wildlife Conservation Society of India, and we're going to hear from another exciting piece from you. Over to you, Vidya.
Yeah, okay, it's not, I have to ask James to share it. It's asking me to go into settings. So can I ask James to share it? The PPT?
Are we able to?
No, it's go into settings and change it for some reason. So can I request James? Yeah, thank you.
Yep, great, thanks.
So thanks so much, Alex, for introducing me and calling me for this workshop. So I'm going to quickly talk about the work we did in Mumbai on the leopard conflict out there. So it was a project that was started in 2011, and it was basically to deal with human-leopard conflict in the city of Bombay. Next, please. So essentially, I guess in a nutshell, if you want to find out what we did, we tried to shift the focus, because before that, we were just focusing on the animal and there was no resolution of the conflict. And when we shifted the focus from the animal to actually the people, we found that the resolution was much more successful. Next, please. So just, I don't know if this video will work, whoever's sharing it. Yeah, you can just, it's a leopard at the edge of the park, because it's a hard boundary, and right at the edge, the leopards come into the buildings to hunt dogs. And this is like the 6th dog that has gone in the building. And this is a CCTV footage in the middle of the night in less than 2 minutes. So next, please. So these incidences are common, and people earlier would get really, really scared. Next, yeah. So just to show you, this is how the park is. It's about 100 square kilometers in the middle of Bombay. The minimum density of people around the park is 20,000 people per square kilometer. We have the highest density of leopards here, which is about 20 plus in 100 square kilometers. So there was a lot of issues, mainly people not knowing what to do with these animals, the administration not knowing what to do, a lot of fear. Yeah, next, please. And this was how the leopard was usually portrayed. And all the media sits in Bombay because it's a capital city. So it was a lot of fearful reporting. Next, please. So, there were a lot of human attacks. Between 2002 and 2004, there were actually 28 attacks on people that year by leopards. And there were both human deaths and human injuries. So you can see in 1 year, there was 20 plus 35, 50 attacks on people each year, out of which 10, 15 deaths. So it was very serious. Next, please. And there were a lot of trapping. The only resolution that everybody knew of was to capture an animal if it was just seen and release it, in an ideal place. Yeah, next, please. So we realized that this capture was actually, and it was based on results from a study done in the nearby district as well, where we found out that there was a strong correlation between releases of these leopards captured and attacks on people. And it was also the management experience. The managers there were also saying, yes, it is a problem, but we don't know what to do about it. So then we realized it's an issue of mindsets. It's of people putting pressure on the forest department to do something that was not really good for the situation. So in 2011, when a really dynamic forest officer came there, he got all of us together and he said, how do we do this? So we said, instead of doing more research, because we already know a little bit and we didn't have much funds, so can we just work towards a participatory, inclusive project and try to change the fear to increase understanding, and try and change people from saying remove them to actually accepting these animals. And it's not an easy job. Yeah, next, please. So the thing was, Bombay is a great place because there are a lot of people interested in the park. They care for the park. And so we had a lot of volunteers. I think, sorry for the background noise here. But we had, I think over the years, there have been like more than 400, 500 people that have come and worked on this project, all voluntarily. Next, please. So the aim was to gather both scientific and traditional knowledge. Next, please. So there are communities there who have always lived with leopards, who revere the leopard. This is one of their temples, and they have their adaptive knowledge about how to deal with these animals. So we mix the two. Next, please. Increasing capacity of the administration to deal with emergencies was done. Next, please. And it was reactive to proactive. Earlier, we were just responding, but now it was before a problem comes, can we deal with people? So only when a sighting is there of a leopard and people are scared, then the forest department with the local citizens and the volunteers go there, tell them the precautions they need to take, check if, what things need to be, is there lighting problem? Is there a garbage problem? So basically the administration and other citizens started reaching out and talking to the citizens, telling them, okay, there's somebody here to help us. And I think that really helped. And the awareness was not about save the leopard, but it was how do we make a safer place for y'all, given that the leopard is there. Next, please. And involving all the stakeholders, major important stakeholders. So again, shifting the focus from earlier only trapping to talking to people, getting them on board. Next, please. So media was a really important stakeholder, and there's continuous engagement that goes on even today in the media colleges and media schools, because how they write totally affects how the public views the situation. And to me, if you ask me, this is one of the best things that we can do, having a very powerful stakeholder like the media, more understanding about our issues. Next, please. The police, because we have a lot of humans in India. So any leopard that's seen, there's a mob, and then how to deal with the mob. Nobody can control the mob but the police. So it was, we got in touch with a senior officer, the forest officer got us in touch with his colleague in the police department who helped set up workshops, in just 10-minute workshops, telling them that we need your help in case of mobs. And this is again ongoing. The citizens, so you can see here that the citizens are there with the forest department staff. So it's always a joint collaborative effort. And it goes on even today because all these people change, and it's important that everybody knows. Yeah, next, please. A lot of interactions with school children. Next, please. And in the residential colonies, like for instance, the leopard in the lobby, the next Sunday, then the Mumbaikers for SGNP team with the forest department go and tell them the precautions they need to take. And this has been hugely successful. Next, please. Impact on media, we actually did an analysis. You can check in Journal of Urban Ecology that it was pretty effective. Next, please. And the forest department now says that earlier they used to get a lot of calls to trap the leopards, but now they get phone calls to have awareness sessions, which I think is just great. And also earlier, the politicians were the first ones to put pressure to trap, but now they also get involved in awareness activities, which is again great. Next, please. So after 2013, there were 5 attacks in 2017 and 5 attacks this year. Next, please. And both instances were done by one animal. And the reason that we could pinpoint the animal, which is so hard otherwise, is because there's a citizen science camera trapping exercise that's being done in collaboration with the forest department. So they know each and every animal over there, and they can immediately get in, identify that animal, and then get it removed. So that's a really nice thing. Next, please. So the impacts is that you have an efficient administration, which earlier was only firefighting, without much time to administer. And now they are capable, they're seen as being capable. There's a lot of inter and intra-forest department collaborations, a lot of stakeholders on board, drastic decrease in attacks on people and captures of leopards, benefiting both people and wildlife. It's the 10th year this year, and it's still going on despite administrative changes, because the citizens are pretty much carrying this on their shoulders. So there's always, increased pride, including in people like us, everybody, even the forest department, that we've done good work. And also we have a lot of people coming in from other Indian states to see what is done. So it's we are proud of it. Next, please. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Vidya, for this extremely interesting case study, one that deals with media in particular, which is something that you have a great example from Mumbai. We haven't seen so much elsewhere. I will go straight to our final speaker, Amy Dickman. Welcome, who is Senior Research Fellow at Wild Crew in Oxford and also the joint CEO of Lion Landscapes, and is going to tell us about experiences of working with people in Tanzania. Over to you, Amy.
Thank you very much. That's great. I'm just going to move all the stuff away. Okay, so thank you everyone for being here. It's really great to be here and be learning about such incredible initiatives. So I'm going to talk about the lessons learned from our community camera trapping program in southern Tanzania primarily. So let's just click on this. So just to give you an idea of the location of where we're talking about, we're working down here with that red boxes in southern Tanzania, around one of the biggest populations for lions left in the world, and also a really important place for lots of other biodiversity, particularly large carnivores. It's a hotspot for African wild dogs, for cheetahs, and really important populations of leopards and spotted hyenas and other species as well. So it's hugely important for biodiversity, but these parks are unfenced, which is one of the reasons why they are so good for biodiversity. They're very, very big. And it means that the carnivores actually use a lot of the land that local people are relying on. A lot of these local people are very, very poor. They're traditionally pastoralists or agro-pastoralists, and they rely on livestock, and many of them are living on less than $1 a day. And when you're having this sort of juxtaposition of people and large carnivores, as we know, it tends to lead to conflict. And this is very significant in terms of the impact it has on local people. So on average, we found that people were losing 18% of their annual cash income because of depredation. So obviously an unsustainable cost for people. This was leading to really intense levels of carnivore killing. In fact, this area had the highest recorded rate of lion killing anywhere in East Africa in modern times. And there was lots of conservation impacts of this, because particularly they were taking away females and young animals, but lots of other animals, particularly vultures, were affected, as well as the large carnivores in terms of bycatch for things like poisoning events. And as well as the direct conflict, something else that was sort of driving the issues here was that there were very few benefits to offset the costs that were being felt. So only 2% of people said they felt any benefit from the presence of the national park or from wildlife. And those few benefits were very inequitably distributed. So they tended to go to the very few people living right beside the park gates, for example, rather than going to the people who are suffering the most cost with wildlife or who are conserving the most wildlife on village land. So when we started the project there was very little previous work that had been done on human-carnivore conflict. And it was actually very hard to engage because the local communities were really disinterested in working with conservationists. They felt that we had the animals, priorities at heart, that we weren't going to care as much about them, that we would go and we would leave. So there really was no interest in actually working with us to find better solutions. So in terms of engagement, it took over 2 years before the communities even talked to us. So they generally ignored us for a long period of time to see whether we were true to our word that we would stay in the field sites. And eventually, though, we just built up enough of a sort of a presence there and engagement and helping the communities in small ways and trying to reach those who would reach out to us, that we built some trust and eventually some engagement with the communities. So that presence was really the most effective part of the process here. And having lots of meetings and just being available for the communities whenever they needed, so they could see us as a useful resource. So finally, when we started talking to the communities, they stressed that they obviously wanted to see benefits from the presence of wildlife, and that wasn't really occurring. So we worked with them on their key initiatives, their key priorities, and these were healthcare, education, veterinary medicine, and things like school feeding. And these were all really useful and were having a really positive benefit in terms of the communities and their interactions with the project. But the problem was that it was leading to them liking the project, but not linking that with the presence of wildlife. So they would wave at us and they would be, happy to interact with us. But meanwhile, there was still lots of carnivore killing going on and still quite a lot of hostility towards the presence of the wildlife. And still people were obviously having those ongoing costs, even though we're doing other programs to try to reduce those, things like reinforcing livestock enclosures, placing livestock guarding dogs. So even though we were doing all these classic things, it wasn't actually moving towards better conservation. So that carnivore killing tended to continue. And at the same time, we were doing camera trapping for our ecological studies. And we were finding quite high amounts of camera trap theft and quite a lot of suspicion about what the program was about. Because obviously people didn't feel engaged, they didn't feel particularly bought into it. So over time, we discussed actually linking the camera trapping to the benefit provision. So it seemed the easiest way of making sure that people could link the benefits directly to the presence of wildlife. And camera traps are one of those ways that you could obviously show a very clear result of having wildlife on your land. If you link that to the benefits, then we thought it might be a better way forward. So we discussed this extensively with the communities, and we came up with an idea that if, rather than us doing the camera trapping, if the villagers did the camera trapping and they put the camera traps in the best places for wildlife, every animal would get points, a certain number of points for being captured on the camera trap, and those points would be swapped eventually for more community benefits, in addition to the ones that were already being provided. So in terms of process, there was a lot of co-development of the rules. So for example, I wanted a simple structure of saying 1 to 5 points for each individual animal, the type of species, and the communities wanted millions of points. And so we ended up negotiating this, and we gave more points to species that caused more conflict and more threatened species as well. So for instance, a dik-dik would get 1,000 points, a baboon would get you 1,500, and impala 1,000, and it was per individual animal. So we gave more for carnivores, and this picture of a wild dog pack gave us the village 340,000 points. We needed as a project a budget, so we had groups of 4 villages that had a cap on it. So every quarter, we would give $2,000 worth of benefits to the top village, then $1,500 worth, 1,000 of 500, and then it would be reset at the end of the quarter. For lessons learned, it was important to start small. So we had a group of 4 villages to go through the initial round and really adapt it and talk with them at all stages of, was it being understood? Did it need to be changed in any way? There was really intense effort needed, particularly at first for transparency. People were suspicious about it. So we needed to have at least 2 community camera trap officers going with us with the local community representatives to download the data, look at the photos, work through the point scoring system. So all of this took a lot of time and engagement. You have to expect the unexpected. So for example, we saw fights sort of emerging in terms of whose wildlife it was. People would often put the camera traps on a border where there was a little river, say, and so it'd be looking out. And effectively, village B would say, well, that's looking into our village land, so you're getting the points for our wildlife. And so these sorts of things had to be discussed, and we adapted it so that camera traps couldn't be put within a kilometre of another village's boundary. So this sort of process of adaptive discussion and management was really important. You also have to be willing to deal with tough issues openly. For instance, corruption is a major issue. And we've had extensive discussions and put in lots of processes now to deal with this, to be very, very transparent about the benefits that are being requested, how they are distributed, who signs off for them, and so that it's very clear whose responsibility. Is it the projects or is it the villages, when it depends where these benefits are going. And it really has led to more engagement and more valuing of wildlife, particularly amongst the women, because a lot of the benefits go to healthcare and focus on maternal health. And so those are their priorities. And the women have actually stood up now and prevented, for example, young men going out and going on lion and elephant hunts, something that we could never have done. But they said to the young men, you are killing the very thing that is enabling us to give birth safely and to educate our children. So seeing that community engagement was key. And it means that wildlife has also been recognised as driving development and a major driver and a major positive force for these people. And lots of people are saying, well, it's like having a second sort of cattle for them. We're now expanding to 2 more countries, to Kenya and to Zambia. It's just starting there. So that's going to be a really valuable process. As Alex says, it can't be a cookie cutter approach, cut and paste, but this will help us work out, when you put it in a different landscape, which elements work, which elements don't, then how can we adapt this for a wider situation? So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Amy. Thank you also, Vidya and Nathalie, for those fascinating case studies. And thank you for summarizing them so succinctly and briefly, which I know this is years and years of work and of learning and adapting. And so to just give us that little snapshot of what you've been working on and what's come out of it has been extremely interesting to hear about. What I found very interesting in our 3 case studies that we've just heard about here is that these are they're 3 different parts of the world, very different situations, very different stakeholders, combinations of stakeholders, And also, as we saw nicely, is that these are never bilateral situations. These are, multilateral, different groups of people involved and affected in different ways. And that there's both this need to address the costs and the impacts, but also the tensions that are there between the groups of people. And so what we're really interested in trying to draw out today, and you've said it, three of you have set us very nicely on this path, is what are the kind of, what's the best advice you can give to other projects grappling with these challenges? What are the things to consider and think about carefully? Any kind of pitfalls you may have observed along the way, how you dealt with those, any transferable advice really from the learning of those. And it's so interesting to hear Amy just now saying you're going to be going to evolve this to other countries, but again, then there will be a learning process there as you adapt to the local situation. Now we're getting lots of questions already in the Q&A, which is great. At this point, we're going to first bring in our panel now, who each will have, they each have a great deal of experience with similar situations. Can I invite to put on your cameras so that I can introduce you? We have Jenny Glickman. Here we go. Sorry. Right. Have we got sorry, I've just lost the view. Here we go. Jenny Glickman, who's senior research at the Institute of Advanced Social Science in Cordoba in Spain, and has worked in many regions of the world. Sobi Roy, we've got from IUCN headquarters, who runs the Integrated Tiger Habitat and Conservation Program and tiger conflicts all over Asia. Juliet Young, who is the research director at the French National Institute for Agriculture, Food and Environment. Could give us a wave as well. And Kate Hill, who's professor of anthropology of the School of Social Sciences at Oxford Brookes University. Thank you very, very much for joining. I think collectively, with the 7 of you on the screen, we have many, many decades of very grounded experience in the challenge of working with people on these very, very often very tense issues. And so there's lots of questions coming in and lots we can look at, but I'd like to give you each a minute or 2 minutes or so if you would like to contribute your own thoughts on what you've heard, or just bring in also some of the key points from your own experiences. So I'll just go around the virtual screen. Do you think, Jenny, could we possibly start with you?
Sure, yeah. Thank you very much. This is a great opportunity to be here, and fantastic, obviously, presentations from all of the speakers. I think most parts has been said, and as Alex, you were mentioning, what could be some of the things to share. I think it's mainly that, as well you said, is that while maybe the conflict itself could be unique, the process, as we heard as well from all the presenters, is something that can be used and adapted to the specific location. Something that I think is important to say is to be really patient, because the process of engagement takes a long time. As Amy said, it took 2 years before they actually start speaking, because that is the trust. Trust is one of the most important aspects of engaging, and transparency. Being the communication, as also Vidya explained, that to be in the communication aspect, the media, just be present, but be transparent in what we want to achieve in the engagement process. in all the components. And when we start a process as well, something it's important not to back up or stop or leave. The presence should be continuous, and that is something that all the projects should ensure to remain once you start to be part of that. You cannot always change the person who is going to show up in these communities, but the consistency of the present is a must. And I'll leave to the others panelists.
Thanks, Jenny. Very wise words. Sylvie, have we got you?
You have. Okay. So a few things as the talks were being given. And first of all, I'd like to thank all of the speakers. They were incredible talks. I always learn so much from talking to all of you every time, even though I'm engaged in all kinds of conflict things. Usually it's with my own office at work, but never mind, that's a different story. So first of all, one of the things that came across is, first of all, why do we have this conflict? And what really interested me is I am a real believer that sometimes conflict is just competition for space. And that phrase that was given by Nathalie in the very beginning, these bush islands, just shows just how much actual habitat remains in response to the grazing straight away. So I was just thinking, okay, there's already an underlying situation there where the actual existing forest is limited and very constrained. And the same is true from Vidya's talk on Mumbai, where you have large populations of people living right next to large populations or densities of leopards. There's likely to be an overlap and an interaction of some description. Not always conflict, but the more interaction you have, the more likelihood you have of conflict. And it's not always a question of safety. Obviously, living alongside large carnivores, safety is an issue, but it's a competition for the resources within that space. So we've heard from Amy and also from Nathalie about livestock. You know, this is an important economic driver for these communities. This is what they subsist on. So anything that damages their livelihood is already a conflict situation. And also, what was interesting and maybe a side issue is the disease factor. We heard about foot and mouth a little bit in Guyana. That was quite telling as well, because there's this interaction between wild species and domestic species. There's this disease management aspect. There are underlying factors there we don't know about, or it's hard to understand. So we have all of these very complicated issues that are underlying factors, but we have to engage with local communities. And somebody in the chat already asked about a top-down approach. We can't do top-down approaches. We have to have engagement at the base level, at the ground level up, because this is where the conflict is actually being realized. And one of the first things we need to manage is people's perception of what is conflict, of what is a dangerous species. And we heard from Vidya how engaging with the media is critical. And I'm so happy to say that even on the task force, we have people working with the media who understand how to manipulate the media. And I think this is something we cannot underestimate. The media is what let Donald Trump win an election. The more we can manage the media, the more we can work with the media, the more we can use it positively and well. Okay, so that's one thing. And then the second thing is the way Amy was using just the photo situation. That was great. But you know what? Sometimes, and I've been in situations in some of my tiger projects where people don't know that there are tigers around, or they're scared of tigers because it's an unknown. There might be a tiger in this forest. Don't go out at night, blah, blah, blah. You take out your camera trap and you show people some pictures, and suddenly everyone's gathered around looking at the pictures. They can see and understand what the situation is, and the fear is diminished just by understanding what the actual conflict source may or may not be. And already perception is most of the conflict anyway. So the last point is somebody, I think it was Vidya, saying we can't just have a proactive, reactive approach. It has to be proactive. Another thing I'm a firm believer is this precautionary approach. Plan early, deal with the situation early, and it's easier to deal with rather than try and catch up with the situation later. And the process is important. And I hate the cliche, the journey is more important than the destination. But this time it really is. The journey here is key. Understanding, working with local people, working with local communities, different stakeholders, government agencies. That working together process is what is the solution to the conflict, not the end point. The end point will always change. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Sogi. Can I turn to Juliet?
Yep,
for your additions and comments and experiences from your work.
Thanks, Alex. I adored all the talks. Thank you very much to the speakers, and I'm really happy to be here today. So I picked up a huge amount of things from the talk, of course, but I'm just going to sort of highlight 5 of them that I think just really came out. The first issue is this: is the importance having really sort of inclusive and fair processes that include local communities. So, I was really happy to see sort of consent forms being used in the Guyana case study, but also, this idea of involving all relevant actors. So that means obviously local communities, but I thought it was really fascinating, this inclusion of the media, of the police, of school children, etc. in Vidya's presentation. And I really also appreciated this idea of representation of local communities in decision-making bodies, as Nathalie was saying in her presentation. I think the second point is that obviously all these processes need to be highly relevant. And I think we do still have a bit of a tendency sometimes as researchers to, sort of think, oh, well, this is really needed, it's really important, and we're going to bring the local communities with us. And obviously, that just doesn't work, as Amy quite rightly highlighted. And sometimes you have to sort of go through rather indirect routes in order to actually, focus on what's relevant for local communities. And I think as part of that, a really key issue is being ultra transparent about what our role is, about what we're all aiming to do, what the role of local communities is, etc., etc. The third point, which seemed to come up again and again and again, is around resources. And I think what the 3 presentations showed was that these sorts of processes are hugely resource intensive. They're often very long term. They often require a lot of money, and I think that's something that we need to be sure we have before we embark on these sorts of processes. And I think Jenny put it really well, that actually sort of leaving a process too early or too abruptly can actually be hugely damaging. And that's something we need to be very prepared for. And as part of that, we also have to factor into the resourcing the fact that we need to be very adaptive. I'm pretty sure Amy didn't figure that it was going to take 2 years to build trust and actually sort of start working on what she needed to do. But we absolutely have to do that. And unfortunately, funding mechanisms are not always very conducive to that sort of adaptability. I agree with Sogi that the journey is as important as the arrival, but I really do. I loved in the examples the fact that they actually did lead to outcomes on the ground, because I think that allows local communities then to become more engaged in future processes as well. And so I love this idea of showing that attacks have been reduced, that police were being asked not to trap but more to have awareness sessions in the Mumbai example, and ultimately this ownership of the solutions by the local communities is what we should obviously be aiming for in terms of outcomes in many parts. But I think one aspect that maybe wasn't highlighted as much, but I think is really, really key, is evaluation of these processes in terms of the process itself, but also the outcomes. And I know, from Amy and Vidya's presentations that there are lots of lessons learned, but often we tend to do that quite informally. And I do think that in order to learn for future processes and actually build up that body of knowledge on, what works, what doesn't, and how we can sort of scale up and out, etc., it would be really useful to have more emphasis at some point or another on evaluation. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Juliet. Let me invite Kate for thoughts and insights.
Okay, thank you very much. Vidya, Nathalie and Amy, all three presentations were fascinating and sent my kind of anthropology antennae quivering. There was all sorts of things I could ask you individually about your work just from a nosiness perspective. But I think just rather than to repeat things that everybody else has said, which I agree with very strongly, and particularly on the evaluation side of things, some of the things that really struck me, and perhaps particularly because in some cases Amy's experience resonated with some of my experiences of working in other parts of Africa, more as a researcher but in an applied context, of the aspects of trust building and experiences whereby the people that you're working with are very uncomfortable about, suspicious of, or just cannot even understand your particular agenda because it is so alien to them. And so there is the sense of there is something else underhand or unwarranted that you might be up against or that you might be involved in. So I think one of the things that struck me is, and I think it's relevant for all of them, and it comes out in Vidya's talk very nicely, particularly with the integration of Indigenous knowledge, but this idea of history and understanding what these people, different groups of people, their experiences of outsiders coming in, of local authorities and national authorities, and the ways that they have been subject to, at least in their view, outside impositions and the impacts on them. So that understanding something about their experience, and some of it can be very long experience, particularly perhaps in countries that have experienced all sorts of colonial impositions on them, understanding that affects the way people respond to, react to, and their expectations of what might be coming in or coming their way. So I think that was really the only thing I wanted to add that perhaps we hadn't really talked about yet. But thank you very much to all of you. Really interesting.
Thanks very much, Kate, Juliet, Jenny, Soki, and our three speakers, of course. I find it very interesting that all of you talked repeatedly about process and the importance of process, more than focusing on the physical outcome of this. I just want to, while we start to collect the questions to pose to all of you in just a minute, I want to throw one question at you, which is, and Kate touched on this, is that we're kind of making an assumption that it is relatively easy to engage with and work with stakeholders, and that in practice is not necessarily the case. So I wondered if any of you had experience of not only it taking a long time, but actually having great trouble bringing anybody to the table, or hostility, skepticism, and how you got around that, or how that was deconstructed. Have any of you seen that happen, or? Yes, please, Nathalie.
Thank you, Alexandra. Yes, well, in the case of Guyana, communities were engaged in the process very early in the process. And in fact, they had been working with some of the scientists in our team for long years before even the actual project started. So there was already a trust relationship. But when the project started, I think one of the key aspects that made our life easier from the start was the fact that communities were engaged from the start in all steps of the process. So they are at the same time beneficiaries, but they are also decision makers. They are also implementers. they are data collectors, they are data analysts, and then in the end they participate in try to come up with solutions. So the fact that it was not a you and us situation, it was just us, us, I mean us meaning them, the communities, it's just one group of people working together for without this more classic dichotomy between the communities and the project separately. The project was them, their decisions, and they're through the site steering committee in which they were involved, they are able to continuously monitor progress of activities and plan future activities based on progresses made throughout the previous phases of the project. So we have a very interactive process, I think, also thanks to the fact that the funding agency is very flexible in terms of allowing for changes in the work plans based on new decisions made by the committee and the communities in this case.
Thanks, Nathalie, very much. Kate, you wanted to add to that?
Okay, it was really an observation more about sort of in a research context, but research in an applied context. And one of the things that we have found is that although we might be dealing with various situations where there's a history of suspicion and discomfort about outsiders coming in, actually in terms of getting engagement with groups that we wanted to work with, we found it was harder as insiders in the UK, getting participants and people to be comfortable and talk with us and trust us in the UK than it was where we were all from, rather than it has been in working in places like Guinea-Bissau and Uganda, where we are very clearly not part of the local population. So that's kind of interesting from the point of view of sometimes it helps to be an outsider, sometimes it doesn't.
Absolutely. Thanks. We'll have quick comments from Jenny and Juliet, and then I'll start taking the questions from the floor also. Thank you. Jenny?
Sorry, I was mute. I was just going to say that's, again, a bit highlighting the importance of trust and transparency. You just sometimes also a bit of the words of mouth. So sometimes you start engaging with a smaller group, and sometimes maybe you find even, for example, a hunter within the hunter's representation that initially is on board. And by building the trust and transparencies of engaging this person, you can see that it's kind of sharing the spread, and other hunters came on board on some of the projects. So sometimes even this within the different groups of stakeholders, you can breach by reaching at some individuals and starting breaking through that.
Thanks, Jenny. Juliet?
Just very briefly, there was an example that came to my mind, which was one where, because of historical factors, I remember one project where I had great difficulty starting to engage with local communities, because they had this very strong perception that the organization I worked for was very pro-conservation, and so they were just completely unwilling to engage point blank. And I tried I tried on a number of occasions, it didn't work, and then in the end I worked with these local communities via somebody else who I'd known in the past, who worked for an organization that was very well respected within that local community, who understood what I was trying to do. And actually, I carried out that entire process sort of indirectly with his help. And that was fine because it worked and it was no problem at all. But it was one of the ways that I managed to do that. And actually, I've repeated it since then in other contexts, working, for example, with local NGOs or, or sort of, or individuals who are just sort of respected and known, etc., in the community. And that often, well, for me anyway, in certain cases, it's worked very well indeed when there was that initial distrust and just unwillingness to work with me.
Thanks very much, Julia. Well, related to that, we have a question in the chat. This is particularly to Vidya, but to anyone else also. It's from Lubabunyam. Who says, I wonder to what extent can you incorporate people voluntarily and in what ways? So that's a little bit about following on from there. Vidya, maybe you could give us a few more thoughts on.
I'm not sure I understand it entirely because that's the only way you can involve people, right? Voluntarily. So
I suppose the question is a little bit about reluctance to come to the table.
Yeah, I mean, you really can't, there's nothing you can do if they're reluctant to come to the table, but, we opened it for everybody all the time. So that reluctance, I think, I really don't know if there were reluctant people out there that we never reached out to. So I don't have an answer. Sorry.
Thanks, Serge. A question that has come up a few times also, and it's a little bit targeted at Amy, but again, generally, some of these interventions are very dependent on, infusing the project with funding. What happens? How do we make it sustainable? What happens when that ends? And in the case of the examples we heard from Tanzania, is there a fear that once those incentives stop, things can retract into the old ways that we were trying to mitigate?
Yeah, definitely. It's a great question, one that comes up all the time on grant applications, saying how will this be sustainable beyond the life of the grants? And I usually take out my 4-point font because I cram in lots of answers, because my general answer in this is that we cannot ask the poorest people in the world to pay for species that in general are valued mainly by the richest people in the world. So if we as a global community want to have these species, then we have to pay for these species. And just the systems and the structure that's set up right now, we can't ask local people to bear those costs without offsetting them in some way that is equitable and locally chosen. So this is one way of doing it, and also it delivers those additional development benefits. So I say to them, the only sustainability I would say for the next 20 years is relying on some form of donor, government, state input and funding, because it needs to come externally because it isn't locally. So this isn't about generating revenue in these areas from that. There are other ways that we're developing at the same sort of time. So working on things like lion carbon, which is much more when you're selling carbon offsets and linking it in with biodiversity, conservation and credit. So it's part of a whole nest, a whole suite of options. But I think in many cases, we shouldn't expect the wildlife just to pay for itself and the communities to get revenue generating activities, because it's unrealistic. So at the end of all of that, I just put that in capital letters and just get stroppy about it. And usually they give the funding. I have to say, for most of it, we haven't had any issue with securing funding for this kind of thing, because it is one of those things that delivers on a couple of counts. So yeah, so I think we need funding for this stuff, and it's my job in that scenario to go out and to get it and to keep getting it.
Absolutely. Thanks, Amy. One thing that a few speakers mentioned was, the need to ensure ethical good processes with consent and so on. Maybe some of you could speak a little bit more. We have a question from Eva Kloos around the ethical engagement of communities and also involving minorities and voices that may otherwise be overlooked or unheard. Whether you have any experiences from your work on how that was achieved or what the challenges perhaps were. Can I go to Sogi and then Vidya?
Yeah, so just to answer that question, first of all, the way my program works in IUCN is that we get money from donors, and then we have grants that we fund. And by necessity, they have to follow environmental and social safeguards, which means they have to follow things like free and prior informed consent, things like grievance mechanisms, making sure that they have a stakeholder engagement plan and process where they make sure they get all of the stakeholders in the landscape. It's a lot of work. It's actually a huge amount of work. We give out a project preparation grant for the tiger projects that we have in order to help do this. But do you know what? All of the big donors are now asking for this. So this is not, this shouldn't, in the future, I'm hoping this won't actually even be a question anymore, because this is part of the project design process. In the same way, can I add a layer to this? Somebody also asked a question as well. How do we make this precautionary approach, the human-wildlife conflict management and mitigation? It needs to be built into all conservation planning activities, and actually all planning activities full stop. Whether you're building a railroad or getting a golf course or whatever it is you might be doing, increasingly funders and donors and development organizations are asking for some kind of longer term planning for human-wildlife conflict that may or may not arise as a part of your activities. Thanks.
Thanks, Sonia. It's very encouraging to see actually us in this community starting to anticipate conflicts. Vidya?
Yeah, this was about, engaging all the different groups of people, and often it's really hard. For instance, we can go out of our way and we can engage, people who otherwise don't come to the forefront of discussions, and we do that. But even within that, often it's really hard in an Indian context to engage with the women, so it is really hard, and going ahead, I'm sure we will do it better, but it is a problem for us if it is not a certain caste or a certain economic standing, then it is gender, so I don't know. Yeah, it's a very, very important aspect though.
Absolutely, thank you. I'm scrolling through the questions, and a number of them we've looked at. We've got one interesting one from Amit Kaushik. These days, there's a lot of buzz about decolonizing conservation. Do we see these kinds of engagements as risking being top-down approaches? Any thoughts from panelists?
Well, I think certainly from our side of it, we really tried to avoid being top down. I mean, that was actually a lot of the fears for the first 2 years, that people thought we were going to come in and tell them off for killing lions and sort of report them and all sorts of things. And in fact, as part of the process of getting trust with them, we had said, we were committed to the community. And then the group of young men went out and killed multiple lions close by us as sort of a test of whether we would effectively throw them under the bus. And so I think people fear that kind of approach. And we were always very, very careful to just listen to the communities and say, you have a resource here that is really valued internationally. If there were ways that it could benefit you, like we could help you create that and sort of work with you on it. So trying to make sure that it comes up from their perspectives and satisfies their needs, rather than me going in and saying, look, lions are important, you need to protect them, you need to stop killing them, and that's it. So I think these things in the process aren't top down because they're so community driven. I think that's really vital for any of these going forward.
And there's, of course, really what Sogi also mentioned about free and prior informed consent. There's some excellent resources on that also. FAO has a very, very good publication on that, as well as IUCN and many others. Okay, we've got an interesting question about outside of protected areas. How do we proceed with conservation efforts along with communities, particularly in non-protected areas? So where perhaps the benefits, we've heard a number of talks about looking at the costs and benefits from conservation and reconciling those with engagement. Let me have another look here. One second. Vidya.
Yeah, I can, while you're searching, I can just tell two things that I think are like really important. And one is planning an exit strategy. When you start the project, how do you let it run without you having to be there? Or the work just keeps going by the communities. And another thing that I feel in many times in the Indian context is that it is often maybe dangerous to get economics in a society that is not very, in which there is a lot of corruption, because that can, it seems to be more effective. This is entirely my experience. I don't know if I'm right or wrong, but when you pitch it as a social good and then contributing to a cause, it has a much more powerful impact. People are willing to work without money. It may not happen everywhere, but I'm saying in our case, it did. Whereas if you get money in, then it often really becomes a bit unpleasant sometimes, especially in societies like ours. So that's just something from my side. Yeah.
Exactly. And we've had that comment a few times directed at, what happens when those direct monetary incentives dry up. I wonder if I could ask a little bit about evaluation and monitoring, because Julia brought this up, and I know Sobi has a lot of experience with this also. And here we are saying it's terribly important to engage with communities and come up with these self-sustaining long-term strategies. How do we actually track and show the impact of that? Have any of you developed methods for doing that and ideas? Perhaps I could ask Amy.
Yep, happy to answer that, and also to just pick up on a point quickly that to think about sustainability. I mean, I think people have always assumed that sort of direct user generated revenue, things like tourism or trophy hunting, whatever, those are sustainable options. Whereas actually I think COVID's really, really underlined to us that the opportunities that rely on direct users are actually really fragile to things like, pandemics or changes in travel, all kinds of things. So I think we need to maybe reevaluate what is sustainable in the current model and going forward. So philanthropy increasingly is a more sustainable option we found for our project than relying on direct users, for example. So just maybe thinking beyond the sort of classic narrative there. And now I've forgotten your question, Alex. What was it again? Oh, how we monitor success. So so we monitor on numerous different levels, because I think there are lots of different elements to conflict and to coexistence. So one of which is obviously the numbers of animals being killed, the number of conflict events, the perceptions of local people towards conservation, how positive or negative they are towards the presence of wildlife. And it's not as if all those things go in the same direction at the same speed, and there are ups and downs and all sorts of different things as there's different dynamics there. But in general, you can sort of see a trajectory. We've seen certainly the killings have been reduced significantly in these areas from where there was very high conflict. The depredations have gone down, which is part of that. But interestingly, the killings have gone down more than the depredation has gone down. So it indicates there that maybe it's not just a one-for-one change in depredation, something else is improving tolerance as well. And we're seeing that now the majority of people in surveys are saying they recognise benefits from having wildlife presence, which is a huge change from the 2%. So lots of exciting, and those are just in some of the core villages, but we do have multiple threads for trying to monitor the impact, both social and ecological ones.
Go ahead, Sogi.
Yeah, just really quickly. So do you know what? It's very hard. We work in multi-donor landscapes where this holy grail of attribution is impossible to measure. But what you really need to do, at least pick some very simple workable indicators, because that's what funders and donors need to see some kind of change. But, caveat everything that you say. I mean, one of the things that's the hardest thing to do is to try and even just go and do socioeconomic surveys with local communities and try and get a measure from one of the indicators that was once proposed to us. We got rid of it very quickly. Do local people see ecosystem service benefits to your project? I mean, I don't even understand what ecosystem service benefits are. I mean, how am I going to go into a local village somewhere where they rely on things like subsistence bushmeat hunting and things like that to start talking about ecosystem service benefits? It's not going to happen. But you just pick the right indicators and make sure that you do it properly, and try not to do what most organizations used to do, is to send an intern to go and do these socioeconomic baseline surveys and indicator measurements and stuff, because this kind of work requires professionalism in its own right. It's not somebody who's taking like a couple of weeks off from radio tracking tigers and elephants to go and do a few questionnaire surveys. You need people who are skilled in doing this to make sure they get the right people asking the right questions, preferably in local languages, preferably with an understanding of local people.
Absolutely. Thanks, Sogi. Nathalie.
Yes, sorry. This is more of a comment actually. So from the presentations, we have talked about changes in behavior and changes in attitudes towards wildlife. We have also seen examples of sort of payment for environmental service, even though it's not seen as an environmental service, but it's a payment for the protection of and for the coexistence with species. But I think something that I think is very interesting also is to try to think of the governance. The governance for the resolutions of conflicts, both at the local level, but also then at the regional and national level. So for example, what are the customary systems that are in place in communities to solve these type of conflicts? And then at the national level, what are the institutions and the regulations in place that allow for proper decision-making in the resolution of those conflicts? And this is, I think, an area where it would be interesting to discuss a bit more. Yeah.
Thanks, Nathalie. Julia, you had a comment?
Yes, I did. Just one very quickly on the monitoring and evaluation side of things. I mean, there are some really nice examples of participatory monitoring and evaluation as well. From the design all the way to the implementation and the actual sort of analysis of the results, where local communities are involved very actively at each step. I mean, I know it's yet another resource intensive process, but actually it really makes sense because they're the ones who are actually sort of coming up with the sorts of things that they want to monitor and evaluate and actually doing the M&E themselves. So that's something that I think is really, really exciting, and that we've got a few nice examples of. And then just really, really briefly, there was we talked about the sort of top-down issue, and I had the impression that maybe we sort of dismissed it a bit too quickly, in that there are some nice examples of working with local communities, which are often bottom-up initiatives, but with some sort of top-down support. And personally, I've been involved in quite a number of case studies now where actually it was a huge help having either local authorities or government bodies or something like that, not necessarily imposing their views or completely crushing the system, but often they were there to sort of set the boundaries around which local communities could act. And actually, I think that's really important, because sometimes working with local communities, they might have expectations that are beyond what they can legally do, for example. They might want to go off and do things that are not allowed. And it can be quite difficult managing those expectations. But if there's a really clear sort of policy, for example, boundary that can be set by a more sort of top-down component, then I think that's really quite important. And often I feel that bottom-up combined with a top-down approach can work really nicely when you're working with local communities. So just to say that, it's obviously more complicated than it ever appears.
It is sadly very complicated, but the idea of bottom-up combined with guiding frameworks is a very nice one. Kate, and then Sogi.
Okay, it was just following on from Sogi's comments about evaluation, and a couple of other things that occurred to me there. One being that in an ideal world, evaluation shouldn't really be done by the people who implemented the project in the first place, particularly for societies where there is a culture of being nice to visitors and not necessarily telling them exactly what they think, which is, it's quite common. And the other one was thinking about was actually the temporal scale of when evaluation might occur, because immediately after a project, you might get one kind of response, but if you leave it 5 years and then another 5 years, you may see things change, which actually would be very useful to know, because of course circumstances change and people's expectations, the work, the environment that they're operating within changes, both perhaps ecologically, but also socially and economically and politically. So all of these things might change. And actually, in an ideal world, though it is, of course, both expensive in terms of time and resources, being able to see how things develop over time and learning from that would be very useful.
Thanks, Kate. Sogi?
Yeah, just tying the links between what Juliet says and what Nathalie said as well. What you've both said is about the governance of the conflict and the jurisdiction and who owns the conflict. I mean, the government is part of the system. They are the stakeholders as well. And I think in some places, one of the things I have seen from experience, and I'm not going to name any names, is the government literally passing on the risks to the NGOs working in the landscape, saying, right, you manage the conflict. But at the end of the day, ultimately, in terms of national parks and things like that, the government has some kind of duty of care as well to managing conflicts and large tracts of land. The other thing is, if you get some very eager NGO stepping in, helping to pay compensations very quickly and things like that. But do you know what? If you do that in one place and not in another place, there's this disparity and you're not working with the government system. There's a reason why that government framework is in place, and you develop sort of internal conflicts that way. But I'm gonna completely step out of the box here and ask Vidya a question. Why were there so many conflicts for those 2-year periods with leopards in Mumbai? I forgot to ask that question, but it just really struck me as quite a. Was it just one or two individuals doing it all?
So I ran through it quickly because I had a 7-minute deadline, but I tried to say that there were a lot of captures and releases then, and what we have found out is that the more you release these animals, that release site, near about the release site, the attacks on people happen. And that was the only management that they were doing. If there was a complaint, they would just catch it and they would leave it in Sanjay Gandhi National Park. So I think that is where the crux of the problem started. Yeah.
Thanks, Sogi. Thanks, Vidya. I'm conscious of time because there's so much to discuss here, and we have about 5 minutes left. So I'm going to kind of have to start to tie this together and wrap up. And I want to just reflect on the things that we've heard several times that come across as extremely important. And the word that all of you use many, many times is process. Focus on good process. It is possibly the underpinning most important principle in all of this. But we heard, wise words about the fact that sadly it takes enormous amount of patience and time. A lot of this is about trust building, and that simply does take a long time. And then the awareness and sensitivity around having to be highly conscious of the fact that you may, as a party coming into this, raise hopes. And what if those are then not fulfilled? And how does that damage down the line? What sort of consequences might we see down the line? And always thinking a little bit ahead of the consequences of all these interactions, some of which could be understood in different ways. We heard a nice summary of different kinds of stakeholder groups, different kinds of scenario from Latin America, Africa, and Asia. And yet it's fascinating that even from this discussion, the key points keep being reiterated. And that in a way is a little bit reassuring, because on the one hand, once we all start thinking about this, it is mind-bogglingly overwhelming and complex, and it's messy, and it's a long game, and you have to be adaptive, and you have to be fair and inclusive and follow all these regulations and figure out how to do this. And then there's setbacks because people become disengaged, perhaps, and you go back a few steps and it can be very daunting, the whole thing. And so I think, to me, always the bottom line here is that, yes, it is absolutely very complex and very, very hard work. We need the support of the resources that can look at these kinds of processes as a long game and invest and support in those. And then what the purpose of this event today is to really try and capture the key lessons and put them somewhere so that we can learn. So we're trying to do that with the IUCN guidelines and with these case studies with FAO. But I also would like to say that this is very much an iterative process because we're all learning as we go. So these are continually learning. We're going to figure out a way to keep on having these dialogues and updating as we go. And we're hopefully going to have a few more of these sessions to explore some of the other aspects of human-wildlife conflict and coexistence. So it's great to have had all this engagement. I'm going to quickly hand over to Christina to finish up for us. It was Christina's initiative to bring us all together to have this discussion, for which we're very grateful. And you'll finish up for us. Thank you, Christina.
Thank you very, very much, Alex, and everyone. So it's great pleasure, I think, on behalf of FAO to make a few remarks. And what I should say, it's first of all, big thanks to Alex and James and task force members and also Oxford University for really organizing this webinar, which we really tried to make in a different way. And I think we really succeeded because we had a fantastic discussion and we allow time for discussions, which is great. We indeed heard several presentations today on community engagement and the processes, which were quite similar and diverse from three case studies we heard. And I think big thanks first of all to all to our three presenters, Nathalie, Vidya, and Amy, and of course to all task force members. So it's a really great pleasure to have you all here and to see familiar faces. And we, I think, managed to have almost 100 participants with us today, which is also, I think, a very good number given the Christmas period and also that everyone is really rushing up with already the family and preparations and traveling. And I think also allow me, I think, to add a few points that for FAO and, of course, IUCN Human Wildlife Conflict Task Force, it's a great momentum now because we, I think, just brought today the first joint webinar. And I think it's really like a talk or discussion webinar in the framework of our pilot study, which basically will have 10 case studies, including the 3 case studies you've heard today. We will be aiming to launch them next year on the occasion of the World Wildlife Day. So you will hear from us, I think, in time. And as Alex mentioned, next year we will be aiming to have 2 more webinars with the topics, I think, relevant to the conflict management and resolution. And you will also hear what exactly we're going to discuss. But I promise they will be very excited. And once again, I think thank you so much, and on behalf of FAO. I wish you very good Christmas and the New Year. And stay tuned. We will be publishing the recording of the webinar, I think, on the task force website, and I think also on FAO's website and Forestry Division. So you will, I'm sure, will see the links online via Twitter and email exchange, etc. So thank you so much. And yeah, in case of any questions, please feel free to get back to us. Thank you.
Thanks, Christina. Thanks, Jenny, Juliet, Amy, Kate, Vidya, Nathalie, Sogi. Thanks so much for your time and everybody for listening, and take care.
Thanks so much. Happy holidays.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.